Humans can use hundreds of sounds in languages to communicate. Across the 7,000 languages spoken on Earth, our vocal cords, lips, and tongues combine to produce roughly 2,000 distinct sounds. Across the 7,000 languages spoken on Earth, some sounds that should exist actually don't. There is a handful of sounds that could be used by people, but they are not, and no one knows why. To understand this topic, we're actually going to look at two different cases of sounds that don't exist. The ones that are impossible to make, and the ones that just don't exist. Like they could exist, but have never been found in any language, and no one knows why. Let's start with the impossible sounds. Like I said earlier, there are 2,000 sounds used by people across the world and across languages. We call these sounds phonemes in linguistics. They represent the smallest unit of sound in a spoken language that distinguishes a word from another. Because, sure, we could just use the symbols of each language, but this idea has some limits we face quickly. For example, using the Roman alphabet to describe the sounds of English. Except that other languages also use the Roman alphabet, but they don't have the same sounds. Think of French or Spanish, for example. We quickly end up with overlapping symbols. Not to mention that English has many symbols used for the same sounds, making it tricky to choose one valid correspondence. Think of the letter I, which can be I, E as in if, or E as in police. To overcome this issue, a group of linguists, the International Phonetic Association, invented the International Phonetic Alphabet, or IPA. Each symbol used in the IPA represents a sound used in a natural language. And a lot of these sounds that are described often feature a symbol with some diacritics. And if we look at all the symbols used for consonants, we can notice that there are some empty cells in the table. While all the types of vowels exist, consonants are a different story. The ones that are grayed out here are the ones we want to look at, because these sounds are impossible. They don't exist because we are just incapable of making them with our mouth or nose. But why? To understand that, you need to understand how the IPA is organized and what it describes exactly. No need to know symbols, just looking at what they represent is enough to understand the physical constraints that prevent us from using these sounds. Looking at the columns first, we have the place of articulation. This is where the sounds are made. It starts from bilabial, meaning the lips, that represents the sounds where the tongue is touching the lips, and it moves all the way to the back of the throat, the glottal section. Everything in between are different places of articulation between these two. For example, palatal categorizes sounds where the tongue is touching the palate, or the roof of your mouth. Now, the rows represent the manner of articulation, meaning how the sound is produced. It's not just the tongue touching a part of your mouth, but it's also how it's being done. For example, a tap is a quick tap of the tongue to make a sound. A nasal describes the air going through your nose to make a sound like and n. A plosive means a sound that is short, brief, explosive, like p or t. Now that you have an understanding of how these sounds are organized and created, you can see why some of these cells are grayed out. Those are sounds that are not possible to make. For example, a glottal nasal requires sound coming from the back of your mouth and through your nose. And it appears that you just cannot make such a sound. Same with a velar trill, which is also impossible. You cannot roll the sound of a trill while having your mouth in a velar position like in the sound k and g. Okay, but what about these empty cells that are not grayed out? And this is where things get interesting. You can see some cells are empty, but possible. This means some sounds are possible, but have never been found in a living language as far as we know. Maybe in the past, thousands of years ago, and we just don't have any records of that. But today, out of 7,000 languages, these are not found in a single one of them. What do they sound like then? Well, we don't have any records of them to listen to since they are not existent. But we can always try to produce these sounds since they are possible, right? We have the sound y, which is a voiced palatal approximant. So if you try to make it voiceless, then we have a new sound that is not used in any language. So let me try that. But why do these sounds just not exist? Unfortunately, I don't really have an answer for that. I can provide you with a guess for some of them, but not all. If you look at the table, each cell has a voiceless and a voiced version of a sound, with the same place and manner of articulation. On the left, the voiceless consonant, and on the right, the voiced consonant. For example, P and B. The first is voiceless, the second is voiced. Well, for many of these empty cells, the voiced version of a sound exists, but not the voiceless. This could be because the voiced version of such a sound appears more naturally than the voiceless. Like earlier, trying to do a voiceless y is tricky, and if you try yourself, you'll see that your sound tend to have a bit of voicing, and it's likely that the voiceless version of that sound evolves quickly into the voiced version of it and then disappears. But that's just a guess. Now, before ending this video, let me add something about this topic. We mainly looked at pulmonic sounds in this video. These are the sounds produced directly with the air coming from the lungs, and they are usually the most common consonants. But there are other types of consonants, like ejective consonants or click consonants. But looking at these non-pulmonic sounds, we can also see that some are missing. We have the exact same situation here. Some cells are grayed out, impossible to make, while some are just empty, waiting to be discovered and used.